In the last video, we saw how the first Christian martyr, Stephen, his stoning was presided over by a man named Saul, none other than the Apostle Paul. In this episode, we turn to see how Paul went from being a man persecuting Christians, even to death, to the man who tirelessly spread Christianity across the Roman Empire and wrote a quarter of the New Testament. Paul was a few years younger than Jesus. He was born probably between 0 and 5 AD to a devout Jewish family in Tarsus, modern Turkey. By Paul's day, Tarsus had been an important city for centuries. It was on a major east-west trade route and had a renowned university. All the great rulers, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Caesar Augustus, recognized Tarsus's strategic importance and gave it extra attention. One of the industries Tarsus was famous for in the ancient world was goat hair textiles, cloth made out of goat hair. As we read in the Bible, Paul's lifelong trade, and presumably his family's, was making tents out of goat hair, which he would have learned growing up in Tarsus and working in the family business. Crafting or repairing goat hair tents was how Paul supported himself throughout his travels and preaching. Paul was born into a family of Pharisees and raised with fervent obedience to God's law. As Paul put it, zealous in the extreme for the traditions of my fathers. As a religious minority in a pagan city, Tarsus probably had several thousand Jews in a city of 100,000 people. Paul's family probably lived near other Jewish families so they could worship and practice their Jewish way of life together. In ancient times, most Jews did not live in Jerusalem or Israel. They lived in cities across the Roman Empire and the Middle East. Why? Because there were two major Jewish exiles from Israel. In 722 BC, the Assyrians conquered the northern half of Israel. In 586 BC, the Babylonians conquered the southern half of Israel called Judah. In both of these conquerings, many Jewish citizens were forcibly taken to new cities, which is what exile means, where they would establish Jewish sections of town. By the time you get to the 1st century AD, Paul's era, there are pockets of Jews in cities all over the ancient world, whose populations, all totaled, were probably much higher than that of Jews living in Israel. So, Paul was raised a devout Jew and lived among other Jewish families. Still, as a tent maker in Tarsus, a crossroads city in the ancient world, in his day-to-day business, he probably interacted with people from all over. Caravans of merchants from far-flung lands and soldiers traveling from one end of the empire to another, all who needed to buy tents. So Paul would have had, on one hand, a strict personal life, and on the other, a multicultural, cosmopolitan experience of the world. And Paul spoke several languages. Hebrew, the language of the Jewish religion and scriptures; Aramaic, the language Jesus and the people of the Middle East spoke, which was related to Hebrew; probably some Latin, the language of the Romans; and Greek, the language of the Eastern Mediterranean, which spread from the conquests of Alexander the Great over 300 years prior. As an aside, while Rome had conquered these Greek-speaking lands, the Romans were also very practical. They didn't force their conquered people to learn Latin, so local languages still flourished. Latin was used for bureaucratic purposes across the empire, but was not necessarily learned by all the commoners brought into the empire. Actually, the Roman elite viewed Greek as cultured and sophisticated, so they would often learn Greek. So Greek culture and language still flourished under Roman rule, hence Greco-Roman culture. But back to Paul. He was highly educated. He knew the Hebrew scriptures, what Christians call the Old Testament, backward and forward. He knew the philosophical ideas and rhetorical devices of Greeks like Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics because we see these arguments in his writings. And as a young man, Paul went to Jerusalem to train under the Rabbi Gamaliel, the preeminent scholar of his day. Lastly, Paul was born a Roman citizen, which came with privileges that Paul capitalized on later in life. So the picture is starting to form of why Paul was a perfect vessel of the Christian gospel to the eastern half of the Roman Empire. This intelligent, highly educated Roman citizen was wise to the ways of the wider empire and spoke the languages of the Jewish people and the multi-ethnic empire. So we arrive in 33 or 34 AD, shortly after Jesus' crucifixion. Paul has heard about the followers of Jesus, a rabbi executed by Rome as a political prisoner, whose followers claimed he was actually God and was resurrected from his tomb. It was all too much for Paul. It was an affront to his Jewish beliefs. He zealously sought the destruction of this cult of Jesus. And one day, one of the followers of Jesus, a man named Stephen, was preaching in Jerusalem. He was saying that not only had Jesus risen, but he was the Son of God, the Messiah. The temple and the sacrifices and the rituals, all things sacred to a Pharisee like Paul. Stephen was saying these things were no longer God's plan of salvation. Salvation was now in Christ Jesus. This was blasphemy. Stephen was hauled outside of the city and put to death by onlookers throwing stones. And Paul stood there watching, presiding over this blasphemer's death. As an aside, this was an illegal execution. Like with Jesus' execution, only Rome had the authority to perform capital punishment. But for Paul and others like him, these Jesus followers, also called the Way, the name Christian would not be used for a few more years yet. The blasphemy of these Jesus followers was hindering God's kingdom and the coming Messiah. They had to be dealt with severely if necessary. Paul would later write to the Galatians, "For you have heard of my previous way of life in Jerusalem, how intensely I persecuted the church of God and tried to destroy it." The book of Acts records Paul's next move shortly after the stoning of Stephen. Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the Way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed all around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" "Who are you, Lord?" Saul asked. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting," he replied. "Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do." The men traveling with Saul stood there speechless. They heard the sound but did not see anyone. Saul got up from the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand into Damascus. For 3 days he was blind and did not eat or drink anything. So Paul receives an appearance from the risen Jesus, which knocks him off the donkey he was probably riding. Even the people traveling with him hear the voice speaking to Paul. Paul realizes that he had been grievously wrong. The followers of Jesus Christ were not practicing a blasphemous heresy. They were followers of the true Messiah, the crucified and risen Messiah who just appeared to him on the road to Damascus. After being blind and not eating or drinking for 3 days, a Christ follower named Ananias came to Paul's door. You see, Ananias had received a vision from the Lord telling him to go visit the house Paul was staying at in Damascus, lay hands on him, and restore his sight. Ananias had argued with the Lord, saying, "I've heard all that this guy Paul has done, and I know he's here to drag Christ followers like me back to Jerusalem to face punishment like Stephen. Why do you want me to go to him?" The Lord's response to Ananias, "Go, This man is my chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and their kings and to the people of Israel. I will show him how much he must suffer for my name." Ananias goes to Paul's house, places his hands on him, and prays. Paul's sight immediately returns, and he is baptized. And just like that, the Pharisee of Pharisees, the zealous persecutor of Christians, is now a Christian. And for the second time in just several months or a year or so, the first being the resurrection, the course of history has changed in an instant.